Welcome all viewers to our channel. We are glad to see you here, where we share amazing stories from people's lives. Each of you is important to us and we will be interested to know what country and city you are from. Please write about it in the comments. Now let's move on to our first story. The city is plunged into a viscous darkness. A suffocating silence hangs in the air that seems to swallow up all sound. Rare cars slowly creep through the deserted streets like ghosts, and the faint flicker of streetlights adds to the scene's sense of painful, parched emptiness. Puddles of oil and water from the rain reflect the sky, as if the city is drowning in its own shadows. Here, in this backwoods part of town where crime has long been the norm, menace is always in the air, even when nothing is happening. The patrol car rolls slowly through the neighborhood, leaving a trail of oppressed silence behind it. Behind the wheel sits Jack Hawthorne, a white cop with 15 years of experience. He stares silently at the streets, trying not to miss a single detail. Inside him, something bubbles deafeningly, like an unseen evil he's learned to suppress over the years. On nights like this, when the city seems unlivable, Hawthorne can feel the tension slowly building up, filling him to the brim. He can't shake the feeling that everyone around him is an enemy, every passerby, every flickering light a potential threat. His face is grim, his eyes intense. He knows his world is simple: either you're in control or you'll be swept away. And every night he rides out to maintain that order, an order in which he, a white man with a gun and a badge, stays on top. He wouldn't be so successful if he couldn't see hidden agendas in people, especially in some of them. He pulled the usual mask of calmness over his face, but inside he was seething. He saw every black man on the street as a potential threat. Hawthorne's gaze had become that way in his years of service. In this neighborhood, where he believes crime has merged with culture, he has stopped distinguishing between reality and prejudice. They're all the same. Every night was like a new hunt, where he proved to himself that his fears were justified. At that moment, his gaze fell on a dark figure near the ATM on the corner. At first it was somehow insignificant, an ordinary man, maybe withdrawing money, but something about his movements struck Hawthorne as suspicious. The man was black, and that was enough to set off an alarm in the policeman's mind. He tensed, his heart pounded harder. News headlines about crime in the neighborhood immediately popped up in his mind. This guy seemed too nervous, fidgety. Maybe he was trying to break into an ATM, or had already robbed someone who hadn't gotten away in time. Hawthorne slowed the car and squinted, watching carefully. The dark-skinned man was looking around, something metal in his hands. He moved forward, closer to the ATM, and then froze in place, as if he sensed something. There was no doubt in John's mind something was obviously wrong. The cop's hand instinctively reached for his holster. It wasn't just professional wariness, but something dark and deep, like an ancient hatred that had been waiting for a chance to come out. This is it, he thought, eyes flashing cold. Another one. The figure at the ATM is enveloped by the faint light of a street lamp, giving the night an eerie atmosphere. The dark-skinned man looked around nervously, obviously looking for something, trying to do something. He moved quickly and sharply, too sharply for someone just withdrawing money. Hawthorne had seen scenes like this hundreds of times before. These movements were as familiar to him as an old odor, too abrupt, too feverish. These were not the usual actions of a man who simply wants cash. Hawthorne watched him with a predatory wariness, like a hunter after prey. A picture was already forming in his mind: a robbery. A man was fumbling around the ATM, apparently trying to open the device. The officer gripped the steering wheel so hard his fingers turned white. Everything inside him froze like a taut string. He was ready for action, for stopping this criminal immediately. But something made him wait, study, waiting for the moment to become the perfect moment to attack. The man was fiddling with something on the ATM, probably trying to open a panel. Hawthorne noticed the metal object in his hands. A lockpick, he thought. His lips pressed into a thin line. His heart began to pound faster. An adrenaline wave pulsed in his temples. Memories of similar arrests instantly flashed through his mind. That's how they'd started, with little things, stealing from ATMs or petty robberies. But behind every such action, like a snake under the grass, lurked the possibility of something bigger. And he, Hawthorne, wasn't about to give this man a chance. The policeman instantly convinced himself that he was exactly what he had expected to see, the same stereotype that was deeply lodged in his head, ready to justify any of his actions. They're all like that, it flashed through his mind. He clutched his weapon, preparing to get out of the car. But before he acted, He decided to give himself a few more moments for confirmation because that would be enough to explain the use of force later in the report. He waited, like an experienced predator, feeling the beastly rage growing inside him. The man kept tugging on the ATM, and Hawthorne saw him look over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was watching him. It was a signal to him. That look, that fear of being caught, was what Hawthorne had been waiting for. "It's now or never," Hawthorne said to himself and abruptly climbed out of the car, slamming the door so loudly that the sound cut through the night's silence. It was the shot that started the hunt. "Stop right there," he shouted, drawing his weapon from its holster and pointing it at the man. The dark man looked back at him, his eyes wide with horror. He raised his hands instinctively, but he jerked back awkwardly, as if he wanted to run away, or perhaps he didn't know what to do, but it didn't matter to Hawthorne. That abrupt, panic gesture looked in his eyes like an attempt to hide or reach for a weapon. Everything in the officer's mind immediately came together, a threat. "Face the ground, now," he shouted, coming closer, his fingers on the safety, his heart thudded in his ears, his body completely consumed by adrenaline. The man stood stiffly, breathing heavily, as if he couldn't understand what was happening. He slowly lowered his hands and took a step back. "Face down, bitch!" Hawthorne shrieked, feeling the anger building inside him. "I don't say it twice." Without waiting for a reaction, the policeman moved forward, hitting him in the stomach with his knee. The man buckled in pain, a groan escaping his mouth. Hawthorne's weapon jabbed into the back of the man's head, and Hawthorne jerked him to the ground. He could feel his fingers literally burning with tension. It seemed as if any second's hesitation and the whole thing would spiral out of control. "Did you think I couldn't see what you were doing, you scum?" he muttered through clenched teeth. "You're all like that. ATM robbery. Ha, you think you're gonna get off easy?" The man tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. His voice shook, barely audible in the dusty silence of the night. "It's not, he began, but his speech was drowned out by the sound of sirens as other patrols began to arrive at the scene. It didn't matter to Hawthorne anymore. He'd found his victim, and even if it turned out later that the man hadn't robbed the ATM, he was already a criminal in his eyes. It happened so quickly that Hawthorne didn't even realize the beastly certainty that he was right. When he saw the dark-skinned man in front of him at the ATM, he didn't just see a man, he saw a whole image that had long been formed by his experience, fears, and prejudices. This man was not just another intruder, but the embodiment of everything he hated and feared. He already knew this man without saying a word, seeing his paperwork, or finding out the details of his life. To Hawthorne, black faces merged into one, the face of menace, crime, and the constant chaos he had to suppress every day at work. This man is no better than the others, Hawthorne thought, looking at the frightened eyes of the man who lay face down on the cold asphalt. Old images rang in Hawthorne's head: ghettos, shootings, drugs. Every dark-skinned man he met during his tour of duty was automatically a suspect. He saw them all in the same light: aggressive, conniving, ready to strike at any moment, and worst of all, they were always looking for a way to get away with it. He watched their lawyers stall, their social justice systems seemingly working in their favor, their activists screaming in the streets demanding justice. But what does justice know about nights of blood and violence? Nights when you have to make snap decisions to save your life? That damn freak is definitely up to something, Hawthorne thought as he watched the man, groaning in pain, try to explain himself, but the words stuck in his throat. The policeman, however, didn't hear and didn't want to hear. He had already passed judgment before this had even begun. Hundreds of similarities to this moment had popped into Hawthorne's mind. As soon as he gave slack, they'd start dictating their rules, but not this time. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Hawthorne muttered through clenched teeth, his knee pressing hard against the man's back, pinning him to the ground. "Thought you could rob an ATM and no one would stop you? Damn thief, you stink like the shit around here. I can smell it." His words were filled with hatred, but it wasn't directed at any one man. No, this man was just a symbol, a puppet in a much larger play that was playing out in Hawthorne's mind. Here, on the dirty asphalt, under the light of a street lamp, lay not just a man, but the embodiment of all the officer's fears. He saw before him, not a single offender, but a whole story, a story in which black men were always criminals, where their only purpose was to destroy the order Hawthorne had so fiercely guarded. This man was part of the larger chaos Hawthorne fought against every day, and with each new encounter, He became more and more convinced that the struggle was endless. Anyone in his sight was automatically an enemy. Even if he was facing someone who just wanted to withdraw money, his hands automatically turned into a threat. Every movement was a potential attempt of resistance, because in Hawthorne's eyes, men like this man couldn't be innocent. You're one of those people who's always whining, complaining about racism, but do you know who you really are? You're just another bastard who deserves his fate. Hawthorne pressed the man hard again, feeling his fear and hatred literally overwhelm him. The man whispered something, trying to explain himself, but the policeman did not listen. The victim's words were empty to him, and every sound only increased his anger. He didn't see the man in front of him, he saw only a stereotype, an image of a criminal that he had to suppress. This black man could have been anyone, even innocent, but to Hawthorne, he was already a convicted criminal. This man's face merged with the faces of all those he had apprehended, beaten, and fought over the years. For him, it was a battle not with one person, but with an entire world that he felt was slipping out of his control. The whole system he believed in was crumbling under the pressure of what he considered weakness, and so every detention became a personal war, a war for order, for his belief in his own righteousness and power. The man on the ground gasped, his face contorted with pain. Hawthorne continued to press down on him, enjoying the feeling of control. How many times had he heard complaints of unjustified use of force? How many times had he seen protests and placards demanding justice? But for him, justice was here, in his hands, in his power to make someone obey. In that moment, Hawthorne felt like the master of destiny, the master of a city where crime and chaos consumed everything, and only he could restore order even if it meant spilling blood. The sirens wailed, breaking the silence of the night like the cry of a predator ready to make a deadly dash. The red and blue lights of the patrol car blared like alarms, reflecting in the muddy puddles and glass of the abandoned buildings. Hawthorne squirmed in his seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. There was one word in his head: hunting. He could feel the beast inside him waking up, ready for action. The engine roared and the car lurched forward, almost bouncing on the bumps in the road. The officer was like a bullet fired at full speed. There was no doubt in his mind, this man was a criminal, and he must be punished. Law and order was not just his job, it was part of who he was. And when threatened, especially by a black man whom Hawthorne saw only as the embodiment of crime, he turned into a predator chasing prey. The dark-skinned man he had pinned to the ground moments ago made an attempt to break free when he heard the sound of sirens. It was an inept, panicked movement, as if a wave of despair had swept over him. But to Hawthorne, it was a signal. He was running, so he was guilty. Only a guilty man tries to escape. There was no room for doubt in his mind. Any attempt at resistance was a confession. The man ran, his figure darting swiftly into the shadows of the nearest alley. Hawthorne's patrol car roared to life, giving him no chance to get away. The officer felt his blood boiling, hatred pulsing in his temples. He couldn't afford to miss his target. This wasn't just a matter of honor, it was personal. He had to prove to himself and to the world that a crime would not go unpunished, especially if it was committed by a black man. "I'll get you, you bastard," Hawthorne breathed through gritted teeth. Speeding up, he thought he could hear his own thoughts, like a loud roar in his head, drowning out everything else. The alleys narrowed, the tall buildings casting thick shadows, turning the chase into a kind of deadly game of hide-and-seek. But Hawthorne knew he had the advantage. He was the hunter, and his prey was a hunted beast that had already begun to make mistakes. Scenes of previous arrests flashed through his mind, when the criminals had thought they could escape, hide in the dark, but he had always been faster, always found a way to catch them. The smell of raw asphalt, gasoline, and fear lingered in the air, fear that Hawthorne could sense even through the distance between him and the fugitive. He savored this power, this sense of control over the situation. In this moment, he was not merely doing duty, he was administering justice as he himself understood it. Uncompromising, cruel, but justice in his eyes. The man crossed the street, breathing heavily, his movements increasingly erratic, like a wounded animal unsure of where to run. But Hawthorne was already on his trail. The car roared forward, sliding down the road, wheels squealing as if they, too, were thirsty for blood. "You can't get away, bitch!" Hawthorne stepped on the gas, closing the distance. His heart was pounding so fast it felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. Every cell in his body yearned to grab the fugitive, to press him into the ground, to crush this symbol of menace. and then he saw him. A dark figure flashed in the headlights. The man couldn't stand. His breathing became ragged, his legs gave out, and he fell to the ground. That was all Hawthorne needed. He braked sharply, the car coming to a standstill a few feet from the man. The officer jumped out of the car, pulling out his gun as he went. "Face down, quick!" Hawthorne shouted, his voice ripping through the night like a lash. The man, covered in sweat, trembled as he struggled to his knees, but Hawthorne was already there. He grabbed him by the neck and slammed his face into the pavement. He howled in pain, but it was only music to the policeman's ears. His hands clenched on the fugitive's wrists with such force that he seemed ready to crush them. He felt every muscle in his body fill with rage and righteous anger. "You thought you could get away, didn't you? Fucking robber. You're all like that cowards and scum who can't take responsibility for their sins." The man tried to say something again, but Hawthorne wasn't listening. He had heard such excuses 100 times before, and every time they sounded the same. To him there were no innocents. This man was a criminal the moment he came into his sight. His every move confirmed the policeman's preconceived conclusions. "You deserve no mercy, you scum!" Hawthorne squeezed his head even harder, feeling his heart fill with grim satisfaction. He was on top. He was a hero, someone who had protected this world from yet another criminal. For him, this night was more than a chase, it was a hunt for what he considered evil, and that evil lay before him, downtrodden, weak, but still alive, and Hawthorne was ready to wipe it from the face of the earth, to assert his power in a world where law was only a pretext for violence, and justice only an illusion backed by cruelty. When Hawthorne returned to the car, his chest was still shaking from the heavy breathing and the adrenaline pulsing in his temples. The incident seemed to be over, the perpetrator lying on the ground in handcuffs, and he was in no danger, but there was no relief inside Hawthorne. Instead, a veritable conflagration raged in the officer's soul. Anger, mixed with doubt, filled his head with renewed vigor. He replayed the last few minutes over and over again, that quick glance, that panic, that attempt to escape. It was the same thing every time. The black men, the ones he was supposed to catch and stop, always behaved the same way. Or was it he who behaved the same way every time? Hawthorne sighed, biting his lip. Each time he felt the weight of his power more and more, as if it were pressing down on him from the inside. If you don't control the situation, it controls you. The voice of an old mentor, the same sergeant who had taught him the right way to work the streets, echoed in his head. Hawthorne had long ago realized that only toughness kept the world from descending into chaos. The more you give slack, the more disorder begins to grow around you. He saw it on the streets every day, those who shout about justice, about equality, don't know what kind of shit the men in uniform have to deal with every day, especially when that shit takes the form of hostile faces ready to rush at you at any moment. But sometimes that weight pressed too hard on him. As he gripped the wheel, Hawthorne noticed his fingers trembling involuntarily. So many years in the service, and all that time all he'd done was push, pressing those who were a threat to him. But were they really a threat? Or did he see them that way because of his own fears? Every time a black man stood in front of him, memories of crime, of fights, of night patrols where every move could be fatal, automatically triggered in his mind. He recalled apprehending a guy a few years ago who pulled a gun on his partner. At the time, Hawthorne didn't hesitate, he shot first. It seemed like the right thing to do at the time. But then, when things settled down, the trial started, and it turned out this guy was just scared. Yeah, he pulled a gun, but it was a desperate gesture. The guy thought Hawthorne and his partner were going to kill him just for being black and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was the first time Hawthorne felt something inside him crack. He began to wonder if I was always right, but each time, those thoughts were instantly silenced, because every time he thought about letting someone go or not using force, something happened that proved otherwise. The world was no place for doubt. This world was a battlefield, and if you didn't strike first, you lost. But where was that line? When did force become violence, and how many times had he crossed it to justify his actions? For Hawthorne, it made no difference whether a man was guilty or innocent. If he was disruptive, he was automatically a threat. Even if he was looked upon as a hero in the police station, a feeling gnawed at him inside that it wasn't that simple, but he extinguished that feeling like a fire doused with water. He didn't need doubts. He couldn't allow himself to doubt. If he started questioning, he would collapse. "They're all the same," he muttered to himself as he pushed the gas pedal to the limit. The car roared through the streets as Hawthorne raced back to the station. It's the same thing every time. You see them on the street and you know they're up to something bad. But was it really like that? Or was it just fear? Fear of what he couldn't understand. He hadn't felt like a human being in a long time. Now he was just a mechanism of a system that demanded order at all costs. He believed in his power, in his right to use it, but sometimes it seemed to him that this power was destroying not only those he caught, but also himself. "You have no right to doubt," he told himself again, but this time his voice sounded weaker. He could feel the anger building up inside him, not at the criminals, but at himself. You can't feel right all the time when your hands are covered in blood. The car roared to life again, speeding down the deserted street, and Hawthorne felt that internal struggle eating away at him from the inside. Every time he used force, a part of his mind wondered, what if he was innocent? What if I was wrong? But there was no answer. The headlights abruptly cut the figure of a black man frozen in front of the ATM out of the darkness. He turned around like a trapped animal, his eyes widening with terror and his breathing ragged. At that moment their gazes met, Hawthorne and this man who seemed to the policeman to be the embodiment of everything he hated and despised. The officer stepped out of the car with his gun at the ready, his body moving automatically like a trained mechanism. His mind was boiling. He's robbing an ATM. He's a criminal. Every movement of the man seemed abrupt and threatening. Every shadow on his face painted a picture of danger. But Hawthorne didn't notice the little things that might have changed his perception. He did not see the man's trembling hands, did not hear his faltering breathing, did not read the fear in his eyes. It was a threat to him, and all that was left was to neutralize it. "Stay where you are, face down." Hawthorne's voice came like a whip, imperious and unrelenting, but the man did not move. He stood still, confused, as if he didn't know what was happening. The officer's heart rattled in his chest like a huge hammer. There was only one thought pounding in his head. He's going to lunge at you now. Any moment now. You've got to move fast. Don't give him a chance. "Face down. Now," Hawthorne repeated, and his fingers gripped the grip of the gun even tighter, his finger ready to blow the safety off. The man took a step back, as if he wanted to explain himself, but fear stiffened his tongue. He felt that one wrong move could be fatal. The officer didn't see that. He only saw a possible threat. He saw only the enemy. It seemed to him that this man was just trying to buy time, that he was about to go for his weapon. Hawthorne was sure of it to the point of chest pain. He always thought that when black men stood before him it was an instinct for him, developed through years of service. It was the same thing every time, fear that turned to aggression, prejudice that seemed real. The man's eyes darted to the side. He didn't want to provoke the officer, but he couldn't figure out how to escape. The ATM he was standing near was still flashing its dim lights, a silent witness to the nightmare. His face expressed absolute despair. He was a man cornered, and he had no way out. But to Hawthorne it was a signal. He'd seen those eyes many times before, the eyes of criminals trying to hide their guilt behind a mask of fear, or at least that's what it seemed to him. Every time he looked at them, his mind nudged him toward the same conclusion: guilty. "Don't move!" Hawthorne shouted as the man took another timid step back. His hands were trembling, and he held them up, trying to show that he was not going to resist. But Hawthorne saw the danger in that. "You think I believe you?" The officer's voice was breaking into a scream. He couldn't see reality, only his fears. The thin threads of rationality were tearing under the pressure of preconceptions. To him, this moment was the culmination of all his prejudices. This man could not be innocent. He was the enemy by definition. The man opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but his voice shook as much as his body. There was fear in his eyes, a premonition of the inevitable, but to Hawthorne it was proof that a criminal stood before him. Every gesture he made looked suspicious. Every movement seemed an attempt to find a loophole, to deceive, to escape. "Hands on your head, now!" Hawthorne's shout was the final warning. The man, covered in sweat, tried to obey the order, but his hesitation was taken as a challenge. Hawthorne's heart beat even faster, blood pounding in his ears. At that moment, reality vanished. The officer was certain of one thing: if he didn't stop this man now, he would do something terrible. For the man, the moment was full of terror. He did not know how to move so as not to provoke the officer. His every movement could be construed as resistance, but inaction was even more terrifying. He saw the gun aimed at him and felt that his life depended on chance, on the random decision of the man with the gun. Hawthorne saw no fear, he saw only threat. The world froze for a second. That second seemed like an eternity for the officer. It was the moment in which the fate of this man was decided, and that moment was infused with his own demons: hatred, fear, anger. The man took one last step back, too slow, too uncertain. On the ground, "Bitch!" The officer lunged forward, grabbing the man by the collar and throwing him to the cold asphalt. The man cried out as his face hit the ground, but it was only a faint sound among the sounds in Hawthorne's head. "Did you think you could fool me? Did you think I didn't know who you were?" Hawthorne shouted with rage in his voice, pinning the man to the ground so that he gasped under his weight. There was a righteous indignation in his every word, as if the world had long ago passed its sentence on this man, and Hawthorne was only the one to carry it out. The man twitched helplessly for air, but Hawthorne did not see his suffering. He saw before him only the embodiment of the evil he had fought against all his life, the evil he believed was in anyone who stood before him, especially if it was a black man. Hawthorne squeezed his hands behind his back so hard that he could hear the joints snap under his fingers. The man screamed in pain, but the policeman was deaf to the sounds. At that moment his mind was seized with righteous anger. Without realizing it, Officer Hawthorne had already crossed the line beyond which the use of force becomes not just a necessity, but a means of self-assertion. He piled his full weight on the man, his knee pressing his victim's shoulder to the pavement and his hand clutching the handcuffs ready to seize his wrists. The man made a muffled sound, a mixture of fear and pain, as the cold steel of the handcuffs touched his skin. "Don't move!" Hawthorne shouted again, his voice a rumbling thunder, filled with rage. Every sound, every shout, seemed to confirm that he was right. He was within his rights to use force. He was a police officer protecting the community from crime, and this moment should have confirmed his status. The second the man tried to break free, his movements became a reaction to panicked fear. He doesn't want to go to jail. He's afraid, but Hawthorne saw it as an attempt at resistance. He felt the rage boiling in his veins, his confidence turning into something more destructive. His hand dug into the man's hair, forcing his face to the ground. "Keep your mouth shut," Hawthorne shouted, his fingers gripping his hair so hard that he cried out in pain. Every blow he made, every thrust, was infused with hatred and fear, but the officer still believed he was acting for the greater good. It had to be done to stop the violence, to protect himself. The man's shouts grew louder and louder, and every movement he made only added fuel to Hawthorne's fury. He did not see the man as a man. He saw him as an enemy ready to break free at any cost. His own fears intermingled with the man's actions to create a perfect storm. There was only one question in Hawthorne's mind: how do I stop him? He felt his body clench with tension. Every blow, every scream was an echo of his inner demons. The world around him seemed to have fallen silent. All that remained was the struggle between him and this man. The blows became harder, the jolts sharper. Hawthorne, losing control of the situation, used all his physical strength, forgetting that the man before him was only a man, terrified to death. "Don't you get it?" he shouted, throwing his knee down on the man's back with force. "You did this to yourself." The words tumbled from his lips, and with every word he uttered, he felt his anger grow. All the prejudice, all the hatred he had built up over the years of service was finding an outlet. The system demanded brutality, and he was ready to provide it. The parameters of reality began to blur. For Hawthorne, there was no room for doubt, and every action he took seemed justified. He felt like a god in this chaos, a master of fate who controlled the situation. But every blow, every movement of his victim caused him an inner conflict. Why does he resist so fiercely? He asked himself again and again until his fists met the man's face. One hard blow, then another, each one resounding like a loud gunshot in the silence, piercing the air with hatred. The man tried to raise his head, but Hawthorne pinned him to the ground, not realizing that his actions were no longer an act of control, but merely an act of aggression. "I said don't move," he shouted, his voice becoming shrill. He didn't want to see the man as a human being. He wanted to see him as a criminal, and with each blow, with each frantic attempt to crush the resistance, he only strengthened his prejudice. Suddenly, as if in response to his aggression, the world around him began to lose shape. Sounds became distant, and his mind, which had previously been focused on the man's actions, now revolved around his own internal conflict. "Am I right?" A thought flashed through his mind, but he quickly dismissed the thought. "I must be right, otherwise why am I here?" But soon something cracked in Hawthorne's mind. The words he repeated to himself began to sound hollow, like echoes in empty space. Each blow became less confident, each movement more and more desperate. He began to realize that he had lost control not only of the situation, but also of himself. Meanwhile, the man under the brutal blows tried desperately to protest, but his screams were lost in the hum of the night, and his body, overwhelmed with fear, would not comply. He was not a villain, he was a victim of circumstance, a victim of the bias that guided the officer's actions. Maybe he's not such a criminal after all. The question flashed through Hawthorne's mind, but was lost in the noise and rage. The policeman still believed that he was right, that he was the only one who could establish order, and as long as he believed that, his inner demons grew and multiplied, consuming his mind. After the abrupt confrontation with police officer Hawthorne, the air around him was filled with tension, like a string ready to break. The man, struggling to breathe under the weight of the officer's brutal actions, felt his physical condition deteriorate and everything around him begin to blur. When Hawthorne finally pulled him off the pavement and handcuffed him, the man couldn't keep the tears from streaming down his cheeks. He didn't understand how it had all happened. How did I end up here? He thought, looking into the eyes of the man who, in his opinion, should have been protecting him, not chasing him. The policeman's gaze was cold and emotionless, as if everything that was happening was just part of a game where he was the villain. "What have you got?" Hawthorne asked demandingly, trying to recreate the illusion of control over the situation, though an ominous uncertainty was already ripening inside him. The man shook with fear and pain, trying to explain what had happened. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come to Hawthorne, his thoughts captured by his own anger and stereotyping. Instead of listening, he just kept searching his pockets. "Were you trying to rob an ATM?" he asked hoarsely, his voice sounding like a sentence. "Tell the truth." Every word Hawthorne said sounded like a blow. At that moment the man finally found the strength to answer. "No, I just wanted to withdraw money. This ATM is broken." His voice was breaking, every word filled with despair and humiliation. But Hawthorne wasn't listening. He didn't want to hear the truth. He didn't need an explanation. All he wanted was to complete the process of detention. Procedure, procedure, justice. Those words swirled around in his head like an enchanted circle, preventing him from moving away from his original version of events. It seemed to him that he was right, that it wasn't just instinct, but a duty to protect society from a threat. He had already uttered the mantra several times that his actions were necessary to preserve order, but an internal crack was tearing his consciousness deeper and deeper. Soon backup arrived. Several more police officers drawn to the incident. Hawthorne, partly not wanting anyone to witness his blunder, tried to pull himself together, ignoring the backup's calls to examine the detainee. "It's all right, just standard procedure," he said, and that inner voice pressed on him like a heavy tire. "I didn't do anything wrong." But there were already doubts wandering in his mind that whispered more and more insistently, "But he's not guilty." The man in custody could not understand how this had happened. His nerves were fraying under the pressure and he was on the verge of hysteria. Doubt and humiliation haunted him, filling the space around him. Hawthorne's every word, his every smile, seemed only to increase his anxiety. "Maybe we should check the security tapes," one of the new officers suggested, but Hawthorne dismissed the idea as if it were an unwelcome rebuke. "No, that's not necessary. It's okay, I'm in control." His voice sounded harsh, like a gunshot. He didn't want anyone to question his actions, didn't want to hear that he might have been wrong. For a moment, Hawthorne felt his inner demons begin to fight him, and he pushed them away from him as if fighting ghosts. Gradually, more and more people gathered around. The streets were filled with witnesses of an innocent man being brutally grabbed. Their gazes were filled with bewilderment and anger. Every whisper in the crowd raised a degree of pressure on Hawthorne. He felt the space around him narrowing, his actions becoming the subject of discussion, and this added to his rage. "Now you will answer for your actions," Hawthorne shouted in the face of the man, who, crying and frightened, still couldn't understand how he'd gotten himself into this situation. Each of his shouts was the exact opposite of his inner state. He was struggling with growing doubts, but he didn't want to admit it. Meanwhile, the man who had been abused and humiliated was still trying to find the strength to stand up and be heard. His words, full of panic and hope, seemed futile. All his movements were a reminder of his constant struggle for life and freedom, for the right to be heard, for not to be perceived only as a criminal. "I am guilty of nothing," he shouted again, but his words sounded muffled, like they were hitting the walls Hawthorne had built. As the situation unfolded, Hawthorne became more and more immersed in his own thoughts, in an internal conflict that was only growing stronger. With each passing second, he realized he couldn't admit the truth. How could he? Each question seemed more and more inappropriate. He was a policeman, which meant he was always right. The man lying on the ground realized that even if he got free now, the scars on his soul would remain forever. This moment of humiliation, this moment when his innocence was trampled, would leave a mark on his life that would not wash away. He will never forget how he was beaten and humiliated just for looking to get his money. Hawthorne stood staring at the man, who seemed more and more sinister and suspicious. He no longer saw him as a human being. He was only a symbol of everything he hated, a manifestation of all his fears. At that moment his life was divided into before and after, and he knew that no excuse, no action could change what had already happened. An innocent man had been victimized by his prejudice, and that knowledge hung over him like a dark shadow that would forever be left behind. Not hours after the incident, video of the confrontation between Officer Hawthorne and the male detainee began to go viral on social media. Moments of brutality caught on camera traveled the internet, causing horror and anger in the hearts of thousands of people. Individuals who had previously been indifferent to the fight against racism were now affected by this blatant act of injustice. People began to gather in the streets, in the square in the city center, holding placards with inscriptions, "Black Lives Matter, Stop Police Violence." These slogans echoed in Hawthorne's heart, but he remained stubbornly oblivious to reality, continuing to find excuses for his actions. "I acted on my experience," he repeated to himself, like a spell stuck in his head. In the meantime, a real hunt for sensationalism began in newspaper offices and news channels. Journalists were rushing to the airwaves, trying to customize their stories to fit the headlines. "A racist cop on the loose," "Violence against black people," "What's wrong with our system?" Such phrases were heard on every corner. Loud opinions, rhetorical questions and revelations fell like rain. Hawthorne didn't understand how this could have happened. He had always thought his actions were justified. His inner demons still raged in his mind, but they were lost in the face of external criticism. He looked at the screen, at the faces of the people who were judging him, and couldn't believe that the world around him had changed so quickly. He was a cop, a protector, not an aggressor. How could he be? Every day, the protests became more and more widespread. People took to the streets demanding justice, questioning the actions of the police who seemed to generate only violence and fear. They demanded that Hawthorne be stripped of the medal he was so proud of and that his actions be investigated. Social media was filled with videos of commentary and analysis. Each new video, each new opinion only fueled the fire. Hawthorne, previously confident of his impunity, began to feel a growing sense of unease. He never imagined that his actions could become the subject of public discussion. Soon protesters began arriving at his door, chanting, "Justice for the innocent." He couldn't stand it. Everything turned upside down in his mind, and fear for his own reputation turned to xenophobia and hatred. At the same time, the man himself, a victim of police brutality, became a symbol of the struggle for black rights. His story attracted the attention not only of local news channels but also of the national media. In interviews, he tried to convey his truth, telling how his life was ruined in the public eye because of a single moment of bias. "I just wanted to withdraw the money," he said, looking into the camera. "I'm not a criminal, I'm just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time." His words went out like a bolt of electricity, generating a wave of support and sympathy. An innocent man who was previously overlooked by society suddenly became a sign of the struggle for justice. This only fueled the protests and the black rights movement. Hawthorne, tired of the constant accusations, locked himself in his apartment, surrounded by fear and shame. Every whisper, every glance from coworkers seemed like a rebuke. He felt his life falling apart. Meanwhile, the political debate flared up with renewed vigor. Opinion leaders demanded reforms in the police force to prevent such incidents from happening again. Like an avalanche, the system that Hawthorne thought was unshakable began to falter. Protesters demanded transparency in law enforcement and an honest investigation into the incident. Within days, sitting at his desk, Hawthorne saw his name become synonymous with everything he hated. Every headline, every article screamed his failure. How a white cop made a black man's life a living hell. Lines like that depressed him, but what tormented him most was the realization that he had failed to see the man behind the stereotypes. Suddenly his phone rang. It was his captain, who had to deal with the consequences of growing public discontent. "Hawthorne, we have a problem," he began, his voice sounding tired and heavy. "We need to prepare for an internal investigation. Are you ready?" The captain's question was a punch to the gut. Hawthorne couldn't believe that his actions would now be under review. He felt the world he had always believed in cracking at the seams. He didn't know how to respond. His own life, his career, all of it now depended on a decision he could no longer change. And with each passing moment, he realized that his inner conflict, which he had carefully hidden, could soon become his prison. The protests did not subside. The loud slogans of the demonstrators echoed through the streets of the city, filling its atmosphere with tension. Hawthorne found himself at the center of the storm, and his life was no longer the same. He could no longer hide behind his police badge. Public opinion had become his enemy. Every step through the streets became an ordeal. He felt the stares full of hatred and judgment that pierced him like sharp arrows. That afternoon, Hawthorne was summoned to meet with a group of activists gathered at a local center to discuss police violence and racism. The clash of ideologies foreshadowed more than just a debate. It was a confrontation in which each side stood up for its values and belief in the truth. The meeting was held in a crowded hall. At the table sat activists who had long been at the forefront of the struggle for black rights, and across from them sat Hawthorne, who clearly did not feel comfortable. He felt his heart pounding in his chest as the eyes gathered on him, as if he were the main villain in this story. "You think your behavior is justified, but it only reinforces systemic racism," one of the activists blurted out, her voice strong and harsh. She glared at him as if she wanted to penetrate him with her words. Hawthorne felt his defense mechanisms begin to break down. "I was just doing my job," he replied, but there was no confidence in his voice. He kept making excuses, but each one sounded more and more untenable. The last thing he wanted to hear was the truth they were trying to convey. "You don't realize that you're getting the job done is destroying people's lives," shouted another participant, his words piercing the atmosphere like a cold wind. "How can you not see that?" As if in response to the challenge, another activist rose from the crowd, addressing the audience. "In this system, police officers like Hawthorne act in patterns without thinking about the consequences." There was an anger in his words that rumbled like thunder. "We can't take it anymore." Hawthorne felt his hands clench into fists with anger. He didn't want to be a target, but his own actions had put him in that position. Each of these activists saw in him everything he was trying to avoid, the embodiment of the system they hated. "I am not a racist," he shouted, and his words drew laughter from the crowd. "I was just doing my duty." But this time he no longer felt the power in his words. The doubts that had plagued him were beginning to cut through his armor. "Actions speak louder than words," replied the activist, her voice shaking with emotion. "You were willing to use violence against an innocent man based on your bias alone." Her every syllable sounded like a judgment, a verdict he could not challenge. She continued, "People die from actions like yours. It's not just a job, it's a life." The tension continued to build, and as a new activist entered the hall, he held up a placard with a picture of the detained man's face. The bright red headline read, "Innocent man, victim of systemic racism." The crowd reacted with a new wave of anger. Hawthorne felt something inside him clench. It wasn't just fear, it was the realization that he had become part of a system that was tearing people apart. He thought about how much he hated this situation, how anger filled his heart. He didn't see this man as a person, he was just a figure to transfer all his rage and fear onto. "What do you want from me?" he exclaimed, desperate to get out of this situation. "I was only doing my job." But his words had no weight anymore. They pierced the atmosphere like arrows, leaving no chance for understanding. The meeting descended into chaos. The activists began to shout over each other, arguing over how best to respond to the situation. Each of them was full of energy and determination, but their voices were dwindling as Hawthorne began to feel that energy turning against him. He was surrounded like game, and he didn't know how to get out of this circle of hatred. When someone in the crowd shouted, "Until the police learn to respect our lives, we will not stop," Hawthorne felt his pride and confidence crumble. He couldn't take back his actions, couldn't erase the day he made a choice that affected the lives of others. Finally, he stood up and, clenching his fists, said, "I want to figure this out. I want to change my job." These words, which should have been a cry of struggle, sounded more like a pathetic attempt to justify himself. "It's not just words," the activist shouted, and her anger only fueled the fire. "If you want change, then act. We can't just sit back and wait for the system to change itself. Hawthorne felt his world turn upside down. He could no longer stand by as he watched everything he believed in crumble. He began to realize that from this point on, he had only one path, a path full of pain and self-discovery. His ideologies, his certainties were about to be challenged. This was the moment when his life and career were on the precipice. He could no longer simply justify his actions. He had to take responsibility for his life and actions, even if it meant facing what he had avoided for so long. The courtroom was full of local residents, activists, journalists, and even those who just wanted to look at the case that had rocked the city. Everyone was waiting for Hawthorne to be brought to trial, but there was already a feeling in the air that there would be no justice. Everyone present knew that the system he defended often protected its own. This inertia had become part of the system, and Hawthorne felt it on him like an oppressive weight. When the courtroom doors opened and Hawthorne entered, he was surrounded by police officers, as if protected by a wall ahead of him. Every step was difficult, for he knew that his actions throughout his career would now be scrutinized. There were cameras all around him, and every moment could be the headline of the next article, the next clip on the news channel. The judge seemed eager to get ready to start the hearing, while the prosecutor had already set up his case, building on the high-profile activist and victim statements that had become the voice of a new movement. The charges were heavy, but Hawthorne and his attorney were confident they would find a way to defend his innocence. "You must realize that I was acting within the law," said Hawthorne, as his lawyer, pointing to his defense, made the first speech. "I had every reason to believe that I was dealing with a criminal." But the prosecutor wasn't going to let it go unanswered. He called witnesses who recounted how aggressive Hawthorne's behavior was, how he indiscriminately used force without checking the situation. "This is not just police work. This is the use of violence," the prosecutor shouted, and his words had courtroom spectators raising their heads. The public was hungry for justice, but as soon as the testimony began, the atmosphere in the room changed dramatically. The sense of impunity enveloping Hawthorne was becoming apparent. He was a police officer, and the system had long protected its own. Hawthorne's face retained confidence, but it was beginning to crack under the pressure of public opinion. The defense tried to portray Hawthorne as a victim of circumstances, in a situation where every moment could turn into a tragedy. They talked about his fear, about stereotypes, about how a police patrolman becomes a target of ridicule and humiliation. Hawthorne proudly repeated, "I just wanted to protect my coworkers and myself." In response, the prosecutor soon put his adversary on the spot, asking direct questions about why the officer used force without being convinced of the threat. "Why didn't you back off if you saw that the situation didn't warrant the use of violence?" he asked, a question that hung in the air like an impending storm. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the hall became even more tense. Hawthorne, confused by his own words, began to realize that his beliefs could not protect him at this moment. He was no longer a hero or a victim. He had become a symbol of how easy it was to abuse power and how difficult it was to get justice. At the intersection of justice and power, as Hawthorne spoke, the family of the victim, a black man whose life had been destroyed, sat next to him. They looked at him with utter bewilderment and anger. Faces full of tears expressed the unbearable pain he had caused. Their stares through the tears were scalding, and Hawthorne felt his confidence begin to crumble. The trial became increasingly spectacular. The media did not miss the opportunity to show how the system tried to justify Hawthorne's actions, making his image increasingly bleak. News feeds were filled with phrases like "Are cops unpunished?" "Justice," or "Vindication." The loud headlines kept the mood of the public demanding change. But how long would this struggle last? As the proceedings began to wind down, the atmosphere of tension reached its peak. The judge took a pause for deliberation, and when he returned, the silence in the hall was deafening. The wait for the verdict seemed interminable. The public gathering outside the court awaited the decision as if everything depended on it. They had come to this trial full of hope for change, ready to protest against a system that produced such injustice. As the judge pronounced his verdict, Hawthorne felt time stand still. The words that came out of his mouth reflected all the heaviness he could not bear. All views, all hopes, all fears and uncertainties merged into one moment. He knew that no matter the outcome, his life would never be the same. The system he defended no longer seemed so unshakable. It was beginning to crack under the pressure of voices demanding justice. But would it be able to handle this wave of outrage and change its ways? Or would it just be another story that would pass by, leaving behind only pain and humiliation? There was no room for frivolous decisions this time. Hawthorne knew that even if he went free, his heart would remain in the shadows, in the place where ideals are shattered, and he would live with the dark traces of his soul forever stained by this tragedy. After the judge had pronounced his verdict, the courtroom fell silent. The echo of his words, like thunder, left an imprint on the faces of those present. For many, it was a moment that would forever change their view of justice, but for Hawthorne, it was just another step on the road to an abyss of guilt, shame, and deep insecurity. The public unrest that erupted after the incident gradually subsided. The protesters went home and the cries for justice subsided, leaving only whispers in the hearts of those who had experienced the tragedy. Parallel discussions within the city government began, but the old rules continued to apply. The system that had protected its own for so long was not going to change its nature without serious pressure. In the silence, however, new ideas were born. Groups of activists began working on reforms, trying to create a space for dialogue and learning, where there was room for understanding as well as hatred. They realized that change takes time, and that every small victory can be a step towards social justice. Hawthorne, returning home after the verdict was announced, felt his life forever changed. He was no longer the officer who took to the streets with confidence, ready for any danger. He had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. His own inner demons kept him on his toes. Every time he looked in the mirror, he thought he saw not only himself, but those he had humiliated with his careless behavior. Gradually, the beginnings of change began to appear on the horizon. Communities began to come together, realizing that change was only possible by joining forces. They demanded transparency in policing, proposed initiatives to train officers and maintain respect for everyone, regardless of color. This process became slow but steady, despite criticism and resistance from the old guard. Every new movement, every new discussion about the right to life, every protest held under the slogans Black Lives Matter, served as a reminder that society was striving for change. These voices grew louder and louder, and while hatred and mistrust continued to be powerful forces, hope for a better future continued unabated. What happened was the starting point. A single incident could not only change individual lives, but could affect an entire society. Hawthorne understood that more than anyone else, his journey to redemption was just beginning, and he knew that to take a step forward, he had to admit his mistakes and try to understand how he had become part of a system that had failed him so many times. A story that began with aggression and bias gradually turned into a lesson about the importance of listening to each other, realizing that everyone has a story to tell, and that behind every statistic there are real lives. In the midst of the still existing hatred, when the loud protests subsided, hope flared up in people's souls, hope that change was possible, that one spark could ignite the fire of justice. And while the cycle of hatred continued, there were the beginnings of a change that could change everything. This story was only the beginning of a journey towards understanding, acceptance and perhaps true justice, a journey that had yet to be traveled, but one that everyone was ready to begin. Despite their fears and insecurities, Hawthorne, though surrounded by the darkness of his past, felt that hope was alive, and that it could not be ignored. It was the hope of change, the change he so desperately needed, and which he might yet be able to foster. Thank you for your attention and for letting this story be a part of your day. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. See you again.